Hello, we're going to start part two of our discussion on foundations. And this time we're going to go back and look at music a lot. So just bear with me and we'll see where all this goes. Hold on. Just have to get in here. There we go. So we're going to deal with, again, part two of our discussion on foundations. We're going to start with Euler over here, who was one of the great mathematicians in recent history. We have Ernst Mach here, David Bohm, and over here we have Louis de Broglie, and in the middle we have music, and music is going to be captured by this array here, and with different notes will be transitions from one dot to another dot, different chords, different notes, different pieces of music, all can be done by playing games with this sort of trellis here. So let's get into it. We're going to start here with Euler. So Euler was held to be one of the greatest and most prolific mathematicians in history. Pierre Laplace expressed Euler's influence on mathematics by stating, read Euler, he's the master of us all. And Laplace was no slouch. Carl Friedrich Gauss, another phenomenal mathematician, wrote, the study of Euler's works will remain the best school for the different fields of mathematics, and nothing can replace it. So that's who we're dealing with here, Euler. He published 866 papers, and he had a huge amount of correspondence that were collected in a book called Opera Omnia Leonhard Euler. And when this book is actually finished, it'll have 81 quartos. He spent most of his adult life in St. Petersburg, Russia, and then in Berlin, which was the capital of Prussia. So Euler was a Swiss mathematician, but he was also a physicist, an astronomer, a geographer, a logician, and an engineer. He, in mathematics, came up with fundamental studies of graph theory and topology, and he made pioneering and influential discoveries in many other areas of math, such as analytic number theory, complex analysis, and even the infinitesimal calculus. A lot of modern mathematical terminology and notation is due to Euler, such as the notion of a mathematical function. Typically, a function is denoted by f, and then there's a parens with a variable, say x, and then another parens. And this is widely used today. People have no idea it came from Euler, but he did many, many other things, including in mechanics, fluid dynamics, optics, astronomy, and music theory. Now, since Euler worked in almost all areas of mathematics, he had a huge impact on many, many people, and these areas were applied into many different engineering disciplines and so forth. His works, if printed, would occupy a large number of shelves in a library, book after book there. And he typically wrote about 800 pages a year, but he did it from 1725 to 1783. So that's, let's see, 58 years, 800 pages a year, plus he wrote 4,500 letters and hundreds of manuscripts. So roughly a quarter of all the combined output in mathematics, physics, mechanics, astronomy, navigation in the 18th century was due to Euler. And this was fundamental work. This was not like, cream puffs. Euler is credited with using closed curves to illustrate syllogistic reasoning. And so these have come to be known as Euler diagrams. Here's a picture of one up here. We have treason in a big purple circle, and then we have two other circles, sedition and espionage against the country of citizenship. While sedition is separate from espionage, but they're both different types of treasons. This espionage against the country of citizenship and sedition. And so this is an example of an Euler diagram. These are clearly related to Venn diagrams, but I don't want to go off and digress on the difference in those. It's not that important for what we're dealing with here. So the key thing about this, though, is you can quickly capture concepts by seeing things are here, therefore they're not out here right away. Visually, it just jumps at you. And this is a very useful technique. Another thing that Euler did is he dealt with music. We touched on this trellis before. So in 1739, he wrote a book in Latin, because that was what the language was for science at the time, an attempt at a new theory of music, hoping to incorporate musical theory as part of mathematics. So if you look at this picture here, you'll see we have different notes: a G, a D, an A, an E, a B, an F, a C, running across like this. And this is an F sharp, this is a C sharp, here's an A, D, C. These are not sharps. Here's E flat and B flat and so forth. And so what Euler did here in using this approach here to this, it was, again, highly mathematical, but he realized that the natural way to handle things was in units of octaves, where you would go from one octave when it would encompass a doubling of the frequency. So you'd go from 400 hertz to 800 hertz, as an example. And he ended up using binary logarithms as a way to describe how to break these things up. And they were broken up into 12 parts. So the 12 parts mean that I have 2 to the 1/12th power separates each successive note. So if we look on a piano, for example, with the white keys and the black keys, and we just follow the white keys and the black keys, going up 12 keys, but just never skipping, never having any spaces, then we realize that one octave consists of hitting 12 distinct keys in a row. But our ear isn't used to this. What the Greeks ended up saying was it was much better to extract out of this 12 note octave 8 notes. And the 8 notes would give us something that was much more melodious to the ear. And so it goes. And so this also led to the notions of having a first, a fourth, a fifth, etc., which Euler ran with, and there's a huge amount of activities you can do with this. David Bohm, Brian Heiler, and others have revised what Euler did, the so-called tone nets or tone network here, to further explore properties of pitch structures. And they end up using pitch classes, which make no distinction between octave transpositions of pitch. So then you end up with a never-ending series. So, for example, of ascending fifths. And this is just an example of what Euler stimulated in dealing with music. The pitch spaces model relates to the gaps between pitches. And these models typically use a distance to model the degree of relatedness. So here we've got a circle here showing E, F, then here's F sharp or G flat, G, G sharp and A flat, A sharp and B flat, B, C, C sharp and D flat, D, D sharp and E flat, and we come back around again. So we end up here having for example, these notes here are close to one another, but they're going opposite sides of the circle. There's a huge difference in frequency and in pitches that go with this. And this leads to having multiple, each one of these for one instrument, we end up with multiple instruments, so it becomes a multi-dimensional issue of doing something like a piece of music for multiple instruments, multiple voices, and so forth. Again, all stimulated by Euler. There was a individual named Carl Riemann who lived at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, who was the founder of modern musicology. And he was very much influenced by Euler, but he himself was very influential. And he ended up with coining terms that are still used today, such as the tonic, the dominant, the subdominant, and the parallel. And in addition to these, the term and theory of the metric and rhythmic phrase originate with him. The Geschichte, or the stories, was widely used among lecturers of music for roughly 50 years after Riemann wrote it. And he documented the development of polyphonic theory of music, and so it goes. Another side of Riemann that comes up here is a simplified harmony, dealing with major chords, minor chords, and so forth. Riemann was an advocate of dualism and had a harmonic function as the foundation of harmonic theory. And another thing that Riemann did was he popularized Euler's tone nets, or his network of tones, in the structure of music, and had an influence on a number of composers. So we end up with this whole notion of modulation spaces or pitch classes that comprise what's going on. So we all are familiar with electronic music, and there is a standard there called MIDI, which you can look up, but it has a bunch of fundamental frequencies in it that are all keyed at the 440 hertz point. 440 hertz is something that resonates with everybody. It's right in the middle of your audio range of your hearing, and this creates a space of which you can have octaves which have 12 notes in them, 12 semitones, and for example, a piano has 88 keys to it, so you can see that it doesn't pick up. It'll, if it has 88 keys, it'll have 7 times 12 plus 4 more that give you the 88 keys in a piano. Another thing that comes with pitch classes is fifths, or fourths, or thirds, and so forth. And another thing that comes with this is the notion of looking at two relatively prime numbers. They're integers, R and S, and we can represent every element in the tone space as a certain number of generators due to R times a certain number of generators due to S. And so we end up with graphs that are cyclic graphs, and so it goes. And there's a fact that there are pitch classes that can be represented by thirds and fifths, and this actually forms a nice group that leads to again, this hexagonal lattice or tone nets that we talked about before. So why do we spend all this time on music? Well, the thing that's been discovered due to the ability to now scan the brain is that the pleasure area in the brain, where both sexual pleasure and laughing pleasure and any sort of pleasure that you might think of, but in particular music stimulates this area of the brain. It's intrinsic to people. It creates joy, and because of all that, how music is shaped can have a huge impact on your outlook in life. let's now go off to leave music and go to Mach, who contributed as a physicist and philosopher. We know him for Mach waves because the speed of sound is named in his honor as Mach 1. And if you go twice the speed of sound, you're going at Mach 2. And if you're going at 3 times the speed of sound, you're going at Mach 3. But the key thing about Mach was he had a major influence on the philosophy of science that we want to keep in mind. So one of his best known ideas was the Mach principle, the physical origin of inertia. Mach never wrote it down, but always talked about it. And it was explained this way: when the subway jerks, when you're in a subway car and it's jerked, it isn't the car that jerks, it's the fixed stars that are out there in space, the mass of those stars that actually throws you down on the floor of the subway car. So it's a little different view of things. You're sitting there and you're fixed in a subway car, but the motion of the subway car is such that the fixed stars are the things that attract you and pull you down, jerk you around in the subway car. It's an interesting idea that bears some thought. The problem with this was that Mach took it to an extreme in defending all kinds of things, and he particularly chose to defend the type of phenomenalism where only sensations were viewed as real, which seemed to be incompatible with the view at the end of the 19th century of discovering atoms and molecules. And Mach said, well, I don't believe that atoms exist, which unfortunately for him, the conventional wisdom was that atoms do exist, and he was basically ignored from that point on. However, he created a chair for the history and philosophy of the inductive sciences at the University of Vienna. And the goal here was to come up with the simplest and most economical abstract expression of facts. So when the human mind, with its limited powers, attempts to mirror itself in the rich life of the world, which itself is only a small part, it has every reason for proceeding economically. There's too many things going on. So any law always contains less than the fact itself because it can't reproduce the fact as a whole, only that aspect of it which is important to us. The rest is intentionally or necessarily omitted. And in separating a body from the changeable environment in which it moves, what we really do is extricate a group of sensations in which our thoughts are fastened and which is relatively greater stability than the others from the stream of all our sensations. So suppose we were to attribute the nature of the property of producing like effects and like circumstances, then we would not know how to find it. So nature exists once only and then evolves or changes, and our mental schematic limitation alone produces like events. Interesting idea. Louis de Broglie was another person who was making groundbreaking contributions in physics, in particular to quantum theory. In 1924, in his doctoral dissertation, he postulated the wave nature of electrons and suggested that all matter has wave properties, or conversely, all waves have matter properties. And this is an example of the duality of waves and particles, which is a central part of the theory of quantum mechanics. This was used by Erwin Schrödinger when he formulated the quantum mechanics that's widely used for the last 100 years in physics. But de Broglie came up with the idea of having a pilot wave model, that there was something that was out there, a pilot wave that was monitoring what was going on. So it's a control channel, a pilot channel, pilot wave channel, and that would explain things. The most well-known example was the double slit experiment, where an electron was fired into one slit, hit a screen, and they all lined up. When an electron had two slits, they were very close together, and the electrons were shot at it. It formed a diffraction pattern, meaning it was a wave. And this pilot wave model and its interpretation was used to interpret what's going on. It was abandoned by the mainstream physics until 1952, when David Bohm rediscovered it, and he enhanced it and published a paper showing that it was possible to develop quantum mechanics in an entirely consistent way with this pilot wave model. And of course, his reward for doing this was to get ignored. However, Ron Cowan in the 1990s actually went into deep meditation and observed the electron in the double slit experiment and was able to confirm that the electron is in fact covered with blocks of information that are constantly scanning the world around it. That creates this pilot wave that we're talking about. And it could detect when there's one slit or two slits, and it would simply check the algorithms there in these information blocks. And if there's one slit, it behaved as a particle. If there are two slits, it behaved as a wave. End of story. Obviously, this doesn't explain why it does that, but it does explain how it does that, which is all that physics does. David Bohm was a very significant physicist in the 20th century. He ended up developing this theory that we just touched on with the pilot wave, which led to a deterministic interpretation of quantum theory. That there really it isn't really probabilistic. But he also advanced the view that there's two kinds of substances, the mental and the physical, that somehow interact, and that this view is too limited. And he developed a mathematical and physical theory of implicate and explicate order, which we're not going to cover here, but it gives you some idea of who David Bohm was, that he believed in an evolving and much deeper theory of the world around us. And he also believed that the brain at the cellular level works involving some quantum effects and so forth. So here you see another example of someone realizing that there's an incompleteness in physics and trying to address it, but in a very unusual, thought-provoking way. Bohm also was not trying to set out a deterministic or mechanical point of view, but he showed that it was possible to do this, in contrast to the mainstream approach that physics had adopted. Having said that, his interpretations agreed perfectly with non-deterministic quantum theory. And so he initially called his approach hidden variables, but later he called it an ontological theory. It reflected his view of a stochastic process underlying the phenomenon that might be found today. And he and his colleague later stated they'd found their own choice of terms, the interpretation in terms of hidden variables, to be too restrictive, especially since variables such as position and momentum are not actually hidden. Those are things that can be measured. So Bohm work plus work by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, EPR, became major factors in John Stuart Bell's inequality, which rules out local hidden variable theories, but doesn't rule out global hidden variable theories, such as what Bohm advocated. And in the view of Bohm and his colleagues, things such as particle objects and subjects are semi-autonomous or quasi-local features of an underlying activity, and these features can be considered to be independent only up to a certain level of approximation in which certain criteria are filled. So in the classical limit for quantum phenomena, in terms of a condition that the action function is not much greater than the Planck constant, is one such criterion, and he invented a word, holo movement, for the activity of such orders. Bohm also was involved with studying the brain, and a model for human cognition that's drastically different from conventionally accepted ideas. And he worked on a theory of the brain that operates in similar to a hologram in accordance with quantum mechanical principles and characteristics of wave patterns. Very unusual guy. Bohm was interested in the nature of consciousness and how it relates to attention, motivation, and conflict in the individual and society. And these concerns were a natural extension of his earlier interests in Marxist ideology and Hegelian philosophy. And he worked extensively with these philosopher, speaker, and writer Jiddu Krishnamurti, started in 1961 for roughly 25 years, and they recorded many, many dialogues. They're available. Bohm's involvement with Krishnamurti was, again, viewed skeptically by some of his peers in physics. And actually, there's more to it than meets the light, but you have to go look at it to read this. So with that, we're done with part 2, and we'll go on to part 3. Have a good